Now we're moving on to verbal communication and starting off with the idea of how we describe verbal communication. So what we're going to focus on is just language in general. And then there's 5 elements that go into verbal communication. So the first one is that it's symbolic. The second one is that it's oriented around rules. The third one is that it's flexible. The fourth is it's cultural. And then last idea is that it's evolving. So the first thing I want to say when we're looking at language is that we're going to look at verbal language, and we can look at it both as being spoken and written. So this idea of how language is created, know that there are different types of languages. So depending on where you live, you might speak German, you might speak French, you might speak Spanish, you might speak American, you might speak Arabic, Farsi. So there's lots of different languages that can be spoken, and they're all oriented around this same idea. So the first idea is that language is symbolic. So letters represent sounds, and letters combine into words. So letters represent sounds in order for us to create the sound of a word, and those sounds combine together to create a word. So words can be written, and the words can be verbal. So if I use the letter A and I use ah, and I add the PPLE to it, then it makes an apple. And the apple can be representative of the actual object of an apple. If we didn't have this, then it would be very difficult for us to be able to communicate something. So it's able to go forward and work on abstract thoughts and abstract thinking. If we didn't have that, then we would only be able to focus on maybe the actual object that you're holding in front of you, which would be the actual apple. So we needed to have language in order to have abstract thought and be able to go above and beyond just the physical. Words represent objects, so that would be the apple, and then words combine together to make languages. So we combine words together in order to make a sentence, and the sentence actually has meaning. So if you think about a child, as the child is starting to develop and they're learning the skill of language, one of the things that happens is a child may make all sorts of different sounds. They make, clicking sounds, they make a huge variety of sounds, and they're going to also emulate what they're going to be hearing. But what happens is when a sound happens that sounds like the current language, parents will yay, and they will reward the child and give them attention for saying dada or mama or making sounds that sound like their language. So they're going to learn to stop paying attention to all the other choices of sounds that there are out there and start focusing on the specific sounds that belong to their language. And then again, they're emulating what they're hearing. So, and sometimes parents will encourage them, and they'll hold up something and say apple, apple, or whatever. And I think a lot of that learning actually comes from, more assimilated. It just happens by virtue of being around other human beings and those sounds that develop. I think about the movie Nell, where she initially, when she was younger, she had language, and then she ended up being by herself and ended up having a super modified sound to the way that she made the words. I think Jodie Foster did a really good job in kind of emulating and creating another language. And it's based on English, the spoken English language, but she ended up modifying it because there was no one else to speak to. So she didn't have any way of honing those skills and making them stronger. So there is that element of practice that helps make language stronger. And then the more you interact with other people and interact with different environments, as students are going through classes, they're learning vocabulary that is specific to their field. And some of those ideas, again, are abstract. So what does that mean and how do you define those? And sometimes words have different meanings. So if we look at the word table, a table could be a chart that might be inside of a book, and a table might be a physical table where you sit at and and eat your dinner. So there's those elements, but part of how we garner and we determine meaning is through the context. So where are we sitting? What are we talking about? Do we have a book in front of us, or are we sitting at the table while we're discussing it or talking? But it can be confusing. I mean, if you're missing information or you have misinformation in the context of where the communication is happening, or you don't have it, then that can actually add extra complexity to the meaning. I remember when I was teaching for my previous company, they had some examples of a sign, and one of them said, "Restroom out of order, please use floor below." So the question is, do I go on the floor, or do I go down to the next floor down in order to use the restroom? If you're not coming from this culture, this can be confusing. You may, if you're taking things very literal, and I think, for me, I studied Spanish, German, and Latin, and I don't speak any of them well, but I just remember being very literal. So if there were any, like, special phrases that were coming from the culture, if I didn't specifically learn them, I would have no idea, and I would take things very literal. So you really have to be intentional and kind of think about it when you're speaking to somebody, because they may not have the same background that you have, so words don't have necessarily the same meaning. Now, so language is symbolic, but there's also rules that go along with that. So the rules govern the meaning, and the way and the order and the format that the words come to you in will also help determine the meaning. So what order they fall in. I remember studying Spanish, and it seems like there were some things that were flipped. So you'll notice that when some people speak, I don't speak great Spanish, like I said, but if I speak to somebody that's coming from another culture, a lot of times the order is going to be different just because the order in their language is different. So they're putting the words together because they know what each word means, but they won't put it in the right order because that's not the order that it comes to in their language. So they're translating it kind of literally. So I know that I do that when I try to speak another language. I'm going to be German was tough because they had everything like compacted into the verb. But Spanish was a little bit more straightforward for me because, you can kind of do word for word in a similar way. But again, there were things that were flipped. So, those kinds of things can change the meaning depending on what order something goes in. If you're using an adjective that's going to be looking at a specific noun, if it's not next to it, that can be confusing. So we look at this idea of constitutive meaning and constitutive rules, and the rules that would define word meaning, what each word represents. And so there's two ideas listed under that. There's connotative meaning and there's denotative meaning. A denotative meaning is more like the dictionary meaning, and the connotative meaning might be more of an implied meaning. So you might have a relationship with a friend and you have like internal jokes that, so if you use specific words, they might have a different meaning between the two of you than maybe they mean in a larger context. Or you have little inside jokes, and words are oftentimes associated with those inside jokes. So that those kinds of things might be a connotative meaning. Then you have regulative rules, and those would be things that look at the order in which words are sitting, the spelling, the actual structure of the sentence, how those elements are put together. So we have rules that relate to definitions, and we have rules that relate to the order and structure and how things are put together. So we have rules, but this also can be flexible. So when we are working again with friends, maybe we have a shorthand. We talk to each other in language that maybe somebody else might not understand. We always talk about twin talk, like they develop their own language. if you have, like my brother and I, we have some things that we say to each other, and we don't have to go through a lot of detail about what it means because we've just had a relationship all of our lives, so we can say things in shorthand. There's personal idioms, there's words and phrases that are unique uh, to maybe your relationship or your friends, and maybe you have little pet names that you call people. I have cats, and I have one sitting next to me right now, and so this is my only male cat, so I call my boy Cat, and his name is Sunny. And so I have different names for him as far as how I call him, so that I have pet names. He knows his names. So if I call him by a certain name, then he knows and he comes to me when I call him. And then also we can say that, there's kind of regional differences. So, there's flexibility in maybe how you're talking to somebody, that if you live in one part of the United States, it might mean something. In another part of the United States, it means something else. I'll talk about that more in just a second, but just know that, you know, sometimes meaning can be a little bit flexible too, depending on what part of the country that you might live in. So when we talk about language being cultural as well, so it's related in a different way. So one of the things I think, and I loved when I was studying communication, when I was, working on my bachelor's and my master's, I fell in love with this idea of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. I thought it was just really interesting because it was just a fascinating reflection on a way that language can be reflective of what's happening in a specific culture. And Sapir-Whorf, let's see, I think it was Edward Sapir and Benjamin Whorf came up with this idea. I think it happened over time. So I don't think Sapir and Whorf were alive at the same time. I think Whorf came later. And over time, they developed this idea of linguistic relativity. And Whorf is the one that's associated with this idea of the Hopi Indian and studying language and really looking at how it's developed. But he looked at the Hopi language and he looked at the concept of time. And he said, oh, in the Hopi language, they don't look at time as linear. They don't see themselves as dates and something coming up in the future and something hanging out in the past. And the question is, if you don't see things as happening a future or a past, what does that suggest about how you see the world? If you don't have a language for it, does it exist for you? So if they don't have a language for future or past, the suggestion is that they live in the present. They might be preparing for a feast. They might be remembering something, but they don't really have language for it. So maybe they don't hang out as much in the past or the future. Now it seems like that got debunked a little bit later. So this idea of them not having concepts for time doesn't seem to have held up over the years, but I think the idea holds true. The idea of how language can be very reflective of what's important in a culture or not important based on the lack of terminology for it. I think it can be a challenge when you're going from one culture to the next if there really isn't a language or a word that can be translated into what you want to say. So you'll hear people say, now how do I say this in this language? And they're like, there isn't a word. There just isn't a word. So they have to use many words to try to say what they want to say because there isn't a direct term or word that represents that. So I think, they talked about the Inuit in Alaska having a lot of different words for snow, and I talk about it in Colorado. We know I'm in Colorado, so I talk about it in Colorado because we have a lot of ski here. So there is one word I know that is kind of interesting, and it's specific and called grapple. And it's sort of a combination of, it's almost like hail, but it's snow that is like kind of stuck together. It looks a little bit like styrofoam. And when it hits your windshield, it makes like a little tinking noise. So it's kind of got a little bit more body to it than just a snowflake. And I remember when I was younger, I had a roommate that skied all the time, and she would laugh at me, and she was like, teach me all this ski language. I wasn't a skier. I had a bad experience when I was 13 skiing, and I went up the mountain. I didn't go up the mountain. I got too long of skis, and I snowplowed the entire day at the bottom of the mountain. I didn't inherit my father's, athletic gene, so I didn't feel comfortable or confident with skiing at all. And I went once. I was 13. I never went again. So that's my whole experience with skiing. And I'm a native of Colorado, so there you go. But the idea of having different language for snow, it ended up kind of being funny because she taught me about this term called death cookies. And it's a type of snow that happens late in the season. It happens when the it might snow and then you get sun, and then there ends up being this little crust on top of the snow. And then you go to step in it and you're walking it, and it looks like there's these little crunchy pieces of snow sitting on top. And she called those death cookies. And it's not fun to ski in them, apparently. It's not, because it's kind of hard snow hitting your ankles. I mean, obviously one likes to do powder. If you know about skiing, you know what powder is. It's a big fluffy type of snow that a lot of people really enjoy, and death cookies are not good snow. So she taught me some language that's going to be very specific to skiers. And she skied over 100 days during the season when we were roommates. She skied over 100 days, so she's a massive skier, and that was part of what she did. So it's just fun, and I joke about it now because years later we're still friends, and I tell her that I tell this story in class about how she taught me some fun language around snow. But I think it's true when we look at it, you can almost see what's more important, because as skiers go out there, maybe surfers have their own language for the different types of waves that are out there, because they need to know. There's an importance to it. And Inuits who live in Alaska might need to know different types of snow depending on what they're trying to work with. If it's the kind of snow that maybe you can build with, or it's the kind of snow that I don't know what they would need it for. I mean, I think about, if you're snowshoeing, you might want to have a certain kind of snow that's going to be beneficial. I know, you want it to be packed on the streets here. You don't really want it. You don't want to be on the ice in the wintertime here. So it's actually nicer sometimes to have snow down so that it's not just the bare ice that's on the road. So just to show that their language can be really related to what's important culturally in a specific area and how that can be different. And then there's also dialects. So even in some parts of Colorado, I grew up calling any kind of soft drink pop. And then I had friends that were from Wisconsin and other parts of the country that called it soda, or sometimes you'll hear it soda pop. But I think you'll see that different parts of the country call things different names. And so that can be kind of interesting too, because if you might have to clarify with somebody, oh, you mean soda pop, or you mean pop, or you mean Pepsi. Sometimes they'll call it by the name of the drink, Coke, and every soda is Coke, or every soda is Pepsi. So they don't distinguish. They say, I want a Pepsi, and then maybe they'll ask for more specifics afterwards. So you'll see different parts of the country relating to different terminology depending on what part of the country they're in. And the last part in this section is this idea of language evolving. So there's lots of rules that kind of go along with it, but what we'll see is that the language will change depending on what's happening culturally. So you'll see new words are going to be added to the dictionary, and some words sort of, I don't know, I think they drop off too because it's been so long since it's been used. Sometimes I'll pull up some of words in my class and they'll look at me like I'm weird because, you know, it's an old term and I'll use it and then I turn around and define it because they don't have a cultural context for it any longer. It doesn't have meaning anymore to people but if I talk to someone from my own generation, they'll understand what I'm talking about. So that, you know, sometimes this can be generational too. Yeah. So time, you know, it's a reflection of the time. So you'll see new terms that are added. This idea of tweet and what is a friend request. If you would have said 20 years ago, oh, I made a friend request, they're going to go, what? No idea what that means. Or yeah, I tweeted my friends, and they're going to go, tweeted your friends. Are you a bird? What's that? Or fake news. So this idea of fake news, what is that? You know, that wasn't even part of our vocabulary 3 or 4 years ago. So that's terminology or language that shifts and changes depending on what's happening. Technology is causing a lot of this to change and shift. So we have changes and differences. So language is going to change. It's going to evolve. If you talk to someone from a different generation, they may or may not understand what you're talking about if they don't understand the technology and concepts that you're discussing. So language is just a huge part of how we're going to communicate, both verbally, written, and spoken, and lots of elements and functions that go into how communication happens.